expanding exponentially in the next 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 years. So yes, and if you want, we're going to have a newsletter announcement. If you want to put that, you can contact Carol Arana there, and they can put it in also in the next newsletter. We'll have 4 newsletters going out in the next year. We had our board meeting last night, and so anything, the request that you want for biological dentists, something like that, could go into that newsletter. There's also a website there also that you can email your request to, and I know this is going to expand just so incredibly. Also make an announcement, we will have our next AABD meeting on the weekend of the first weekend of March. I think it's 4, 5, and 6, something like that. Bill, is that correct, Bill? So we, yeah, but so as soon as we give it to you, we'll have it before this weekend is out. So you'll mark it down your calendar, because next year we want to double this group size. Also, I believe for our 20th year anniversary, we're talking about having an AABD meeting. I think it's 2006 in Hawaii, probably the big island of Hawaii is where we're looking at. So we'll probably, yes. 5/6/7 2004 March. Put that in your calendar. We'll get it. We'll get it confirmed. Yes, and yes, bring a colleague is right. Today, I've been asked to introduce Dr. Jerry Tennant, who is an ophthalmologist from Texas. And every period of time, there comes along a idea or a concept or a technique that revolutionizes the healing area. I felt in 1974 when Dr. Voll came in to the United States that began for me a revolution in my healing capacity, my learning, and it just opened up a whole new vista and created a whole new paradigm in, I believe, what we call bioenergetic medicine. Since that time, there have been many inventions that have come along, but about 6 months ago, intuitively, and I work on an intuitive basis, I think many people in the energetic field over a time of 20 or 30 years become quite intuitive. There was a technology that came along that to me was truly revolutionary. When I took this course with Dr. Tennant, and I spent some time, there was a technique that he taught that he and a chiropractor developed. And this particular technology here is called SCENER, S-C-E-N-E-R, and he'll do an acronyms on what this means, but it's 20 years of Russian research on the cosmonaut space program to develop a healing system because they could not get a physician, surgeon, or doctor in space. They had 6 to 9 months that they were trapped up there for, and if they had an illness, an infection, a critical heart attack, a stroke, I mean, this little looks like a TV clicker is 20 years, and probably if we put it into our research dollars, $100 million of research money. Dr. Tennant is going to give an overview of this, and he's also going to give a workshop tonight. I'm going to tell all of you here that this is probably one of the most important and most exciting technologies that I've ever seen. In the dental, cranial, sacral, TMJ, medicine, orthopedic, you name it, there's one area that I feel this will revolutionize medicine. And I believe and I hope Jerry will come out and teach the courses through AABD in the next following years to come. This particular technology is what caught my imagination was in 30 years of practicing dentistry, head and neck, trauma, whiplash injuries, TMJ, expert TMJ, all these other things. There was something, nathology, there's something missing, and that was, I said, you cannot put a person into a certain bite position unless their head and neck was integrated and on. This technology is the first time I've ever seen a system that in 5 minutes or less can reset the atlas axis alignment of the head and neck based on the sternocleidoid muscle system and completely open up the energies of the whole head, neck, and spine. And for the first time, it would be like connecting heaven and earth. And Jerry has been studying this, and he may share his story with you, but he is probably one of his presentation, his professionalism, and his expertise. I'm sure this will be well worth your whole trip out to Carmel. And this is what AABD is about, to give you that cutting-edge knowledge to take home and open up passion in your healing practice and passion in your life for learning. And that, I open this next presentation to Dr. Jerry Tennant from Texas.
Thank you very much, Vaughn. I guess this microphone's working? Yeah. Terrific. Well, I'm very honored and grateful to have the opportunity to come and visit with you here for the next hour and a half or 2 hours. And I hope that you'll not find it necessary to take notes. I have available for you this entire presentation on a CD-ROM. So I'm going to have Barbara, my associate, pass around a list. If you want that, just sign up and we'll send it to you so you don't have to take notes. I'm going to talk to you in general about energetic medicine and then in specific about this device called a scanar. Now, what's an ophthalmologist doing speaking to a dental convention? Well, let me just tell you what my goal is, and then I'm going to go into the details of how I think that you can do this. With what I'm going to show you today, you'll be able to eliminate most cases of TMJ in less than 5 minutes. You'll solve most problems with bite in the same amount of time. You'll solve most of your cases of nighttime grinding, and you'll stop the patients who keep coming back to you and saying this tooth hurts and this tooth hurts and you can't find anything wrong with it. You'll be able to solve that problem. You can repair some of the cavitations. You can get rid of abscesses, and you can quickly get rid of oral herpetic lesions. So that's what I'm going to teach you about how to do in the next hour or so. Now, let me just show you some of the summary of what the device is capable of doing. This is a case published by Yuri Gorfinkel, and it's a summary of 17,309 cases. And if you look at all of these cases, the cure rate was 85%, the improvement rate is 95%, the average number of treatments is 12, with the average total time it takes to cure these chronic diseases is approximately 4 hours. Now, if you look at the cases, they're broken down into different types, respiratory and all these different things from asthma to flu to whatever, and digestive system, etc. And we have these, they'll be on the disc if you want it, plus we have these if you want to see the actual numbers. We won't spend the time looking at each one, but the point is that in every organ system of the body, we have these rather amazing results. So I'm going to try to help you understand how it's possible that something that looks as innocuous as a TV remote control can achieve this kind of success in such a wide range of anomalies or disease processes. Now, I'm a private physician. I have a clinic called Computerized Stress Reduction, and I provide this in this private clinic. The information I'm giving you is something I'm personally responsible for. I teach for, but I don't speak for the manufacturer. The manufacturer of and distributor of the device is Synergy Medical Group, and there's a booth here, and Barbara that you saw handing out the slides is with the Synergy Medical Group. Now, I practiced ophthalmology for about 30 years, from 1964 to 1995, and I did more of the FDA study for the excimer laser that's used for LASIK than anyone in the U.S., and it was great fun. I had a lot of fun doing that research. But we didn't know that the viruses and antigens from the patient's eyes would go through our surgery masks, and so I inhaled a bunch of viruses, and I ended up with encephalitis, neuropathies, low platelet count, and nervous system defects in 1994. I could see a patient, know what was wrong with him, but I couldn't remember how to write the prescription. Plus, I had spastic movements of my arms and legs that would come on at any given time, and as you may guess, if you're operating inside an eyeball and you do this, it doesn't work very well. And so I had to quit working. And I quit working on November 30th of 1995. This is how I spent the next 7 years. I spent about 16 hours a day sleeping. I would have sometimes 2, maybe 3 hours a day in which I could do cognitive thinking, like reading the mail or reading the newspaper, etc. And then just like a switch, it would switch off, and I was worthless for anything except pulling weeds, which I hate to do. This is how I looked in 1999. My oncologist told me that I would develop Burkitt's lymphoma and that nothing could be done, and that my blood profile suggested that I would die somewhere in the summer of 1999. As the great author Mark Twain said, the rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. I think you can tell the difference between the way I looked here at Christmas time of '99 and the way I looked at the Christmas time a couple of months ago. And to make the pictures more complete, I've made them the same size. And if you can't tell any difference in those two, I don't want to hear about it. My health has been improving since I discovered energetic medicine, and I'm here to try to teach you about the tools that saved my life when traditional medicine could not, and how you can use them in your practice. Now, to many groups, these concepts are as foreign as a foreign language, or the first time you flew in an airplane. To this group, that's not going to be true. Now, I pioneered outpatient eye surgery in this country, implant surgery, excimer laser surgery, and in each of those events I was told I was crazy and was kicked off hospital staffs and so forth for doing these kinds of outrageous things that, as you know, are now standard operating procedures. But the problem is that in American medicine, as you know, it's been controlled by this concept: if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Well, fortunately, now with Pentium class computers and other devices, we can measure what used to be thought to be fairy tales. The theory in traditional medicine is that the body is a complex system of chemical reactions, and the best way to influence it is with other chemicals. The theory I like for energetic medicine is that the body knows how to heal itself, and if it has enough energy and all of its switches are flipped on, then it will go fix it. A very powerful statement if you think about it for a moment, that the body knows how to heal itself, and if it has enough energy and all of the switches are flipped on, it will indeed heal itself. And I'm going to try to show you that that's true. Now, my introduction to energetic medicine began with my friend Janet, who was a nurse and a patient and a friend. And Janet had this lymphoma that you can see around her neck here. She had one in her axilla, one in her kidney, and one in her spleen. MD Anderson said there was nothing more that they could do for her. And so she went to Mexico to try Laetrile. Now, Laetrile didn't work, but one night in a restaurant she met Dr. Bob Vance, an internist from Las Vegas, who said to Janet, being obvious what was wrong with her, said, well, why don't you come over to our clinic? Lymphoma's a piece of cake. And she thought, yeah, a piece of cake with all I've been through with radiation, chemotherapy, et cetera, et cetera. But a few nights later, she was going in and out of consciousness as this tumor was choking her to death. And so she said, if I live through the night, in the morning I'm going to go see Bob Vance. And she did, and this Polaroid was taken. And 4 days later, she looked like this. Now, this photo, as you can see, was taken 3 weeks later when they finished their therapy, but nevertheless, that was the process. Now, when Janet sent me these pictures, I was amazed, and so I dragged myself out of bed and went to see what they were doing, and that was my introduction to energetic medicine. Janet is still alive and well and doing just great, thank you. Now, Janet's cure was effected with the homeopathics from Sanum, the pleomorphic remedies, large doses of IV vitamin C, removing her dental amalgams and detoxifying her to remove mercury. But so she did not have therapy with the scanner. It wasn't in this country at that time. So that was my introduction. So let me try to share with you some of the things that I've learned since that time. There's some new concepts about how we heal. Whenever we have an injury or an infection or some other malfunction of the tissue, the area becomes electropositive. Now, this electropositive signal goes through the up to the digital brain by way of the acupuncture meridians. The brain decides how to cure the area and sends an instruction set back to the area by way of the analog perineural nervous system. And this system sets up local ionic capacitors to serve as batteries to keep the area electropositive until the healing is complete. These local capacitors communicate to the local chemistry by way of electromagnetic frequencies, and it's necessary for the area to remain electropositive if healing is to occur, because everything you need to heal is electronegative. Red blood cells, white blood cells, proteins, fats, they're all electronegative, and they're simply drawn into the area by the charge. We were all taught about chemotaxis, which probably doesn't exist. It's a theory that's been repeated so many times that we've come to believe it's true, but there is no proof that chemotaxis is real, and it's probably all based on the polarity. So in summary then, whenever you have an injury, the area becomes electropositive. A signal is sent to the brain that says, hey, there's something down here needs to be healed. It sets up these local capacitors to provide the ongoing energy necessary to keep this electropositive, and the things you need to heal are simply drawn into the area and healing occurs. Now, if it happens that the area that's injured becomes electronegative, healing stops. It stops because minus repels minus, and everything you need to heal is repelled instead of being drawn into the area. In addition, the brain can't find anything that's electropositive, so it assumes that all is well. Notice that the part of the brain that recognizes something needs to be healed and the part of the brain that recognizes pain are two different areas. So an area can hurt and the brain still not know it needs to be healed. So as there's no ongoing support for maintaining ionic capacitors, maintaining the charge, eventually this area consumes what charge is available and the area becomes energy depleted. Now, once you understand that paradigm, how to heal it becomes much easier, and it's certainly a different way to think about it. If you have an area that's energy depleted, you have to restore that energy. Once you restore the energy, then you can go flip this switch from, which I call a circuit breaker, from electronegative back to electropositive, and immediately the body starts healing itself. That's sort of the nuts and bolts of how it works. Now let's take a look at understanding on a cellular level how this happens. First of all, before we go into cellular physiology, I want to remind you of the work of Bob Becker. As you know, Bob Becker was an orthopedic surgeon who got interested in why bones sometimes don't heal. He also recognized the fact that in the human and many other species, healing, with the exception of bone, is by scarring. So in the human, if you have an injury, if it's anything other than bone, the area will be healed with scar tissue. However, in bone, in the human, the bone is able to make more bone. It's able to regenerate. So the question is, if bone can regenerate in the human, how does it happen, and why doesn't it happen in other tissue? So Becker began to research this, and as his research model, he chose this little guy, the salamander. Why the salamander? The salamander has all the same parts as a human, all the same little bones, all the same nerves, all the same everything as a human. The big difference is that the salamander is able to regenerate. The salamander can grow an exact replacement for an eye, an arm, a leg, an ear, up to 1/3 of its brain, almost all of its digestive system, and up to half of its heart. So you can excise this out of a salamander. Just think about it for a minute. You can take out the entire digestive system of a salamander, he'll simply grow a new one. Same thing, punch out his eye, no problem, he'll grow a new eye. So it's an incredible animal model for us to try to understand about regeneration. The salamander is so efficient at regrowing parts that you can't give it cancer. And the ability of the salamander to grow all of these parts cannot be explained chemically, so Becker began to look at it from an electric standpoint. So what he would do is he would take a salamander and he'd amputate an arm, and then he noticed that the skin would grow over the stump, that the cut ends in the stump would be connected to each skin cell by the nerve, and that he called a neuroepithelial junction. Now this neuroepithelial junction turned out to be important because it creates a negative electric current. Remember, we told you that anytime you have an injury, you have a positive current of injury, so when you amputate the arm, it's electropositive, but as soon as it forms a neuroepithelial junction, the area becomes electronegative. And that's important because this small amount of negative current changes normal cells back to stem cells. Now, as you know, most of us are trained that once a cell differentiates, it cannot de-differentiate, right? But Becker has shown that that's not true. If you have the appropriate amount of negative electric current, normal cells will de-differentiate back into stem cells. Now, once you get a wad of these stem cells, he called it a blastema. That blastema then is what grows into a new body part. So here's a summary. You cut it off, you get the skin growing around the end, you get the nerves growing into the skin cells, forming a neuroepithelial junction. That creates a negative current, which creates a blastema, which is a wad of stem cells, which then grows a new part. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. You amputate the salamander's arm, you wait until it develops a blastema. After it develops a blastema, but before 10 days has gone by, if you remove that wad of stem cells and put it somewhere else in the body, say, for example, you make a slit beside the salamander's tail and you stuff that blastema in that slit, the salamander will grow a new tail. If you put it beside a hind leg, it'll grow a second hind leg. It will grow whatever is the local organ system. But if you wait till more than 10 days go by and you harvest the blastema and you put it someplace else, it will grow another arm. So if you make a slit beside the tail and you put that wad of blastema in that there, you'll grow a forearm right beside the tail. If you make a slit on the top of the head and stuff it in there, it grows an arm out the top of its head. So it became obvious that this blastema was being programmed as to what it should grow into sometime during the first 10 days. So the question is, where did the programming come from? Well, he assumed that it was probably from the nerves, and so he went in and he would cut the nerves going into the arm, but it kept working. He did not interrupt its ability to program itself into what to grow into. So he couldn't figure this out, so he went back and sectioned the salamander in very small sections, and what he discovered was that there is a second nervous system in the body that's totally independent from the primary nervous system. And this nervous system was what was quickly regrowing back into the neuroepithelial junction and then reprogramming the cells. So what Becker was able to show is we have two separate nervous systems. The one we all know about, the brain, spinal cord, etc., the nerves we know about, is digital. And we have a second system that is in control of healing, and that he calls the perineural nervous system, which we always were taught was simply fibrous tissue, glial cells, swan cells, etc., and that system that is analog, and that's just that the more ancient analog system is actually in control of the digital system. So the second system, which he called the analog perineural nervous system, delivers information to the blastema about how to grow a new body part, and that the traditional direct current DC nervous system has nothing to do with it. This analog system senses injury and controls repair. It controls the local environment. In fact, it's the primary system in the brain and regulates our consciousness and regulates decision making. Amazing, isn't it, that we have a second nervous system that most of us don't even know exists, and it's in charge of the one we do know exists. Fun stuff. Now, remember that the current of injury is always positive, electropositive initially, and lasts as long as healing is occurring, for example, weeks. In animals that can't regenerate, like the human, it stays positive and healing is by scarring, but in all animals that are capable of regeneration, like the salamander, it turns electronegative. In the human, the only regeneration that occurs is bone, and guess what? Bone follows the salamander model. If you injure bone, it's initially electropositive, then it turns electronegative, and the electronegative current is what causes new bone to be formed. So the current, having an electronegative current is important for regeneration, and it dictates the ability to regenerate. Now, incidentally, just as an aside, the current in cancer is always electronegative, as shown by Bjorn Nordenstrom. And in fact, Nordenstrom has, as you probably know, has been able to eliminate cancers by simply putting an electrode in the middle of the tumor another electrode in the dermis, and having the patient wear a battery pack on their waist, and the current simply causes the cancers to melt away. One of the things, sometimes I have these nights when I wake up and I can't go to sleep because my mind won't shut off. I'm sure you've had those nights as well. And one of those nights I was thinking about something that I'll share with you. It's not been proven. It's just gee, what do you think about this kind of idea? It seems that, cancers seem to just arise de novo in the body. And it's as if, since cancer cells are immature cells, it's as if there was created an electronegative current in the body that caused the normal cells to convert back to a more immature form. But they never got programmed, so they don't know what to do. So they just keep growing. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'll throw it out there for something. So if you wake up tonight and can't sleep, it gives you something to think about. Well, as you know, Becker got a lot of harassment about his concept of dedifferentiation of cells, but he did some other things that helped prove his point. Frog red blood cells, as you know, are nucleated, and with very small amounts of negative current, they will dedifferentiate. But if you use larger amounts of current, this doesn't happen. So the trick is to have small enough amount of electronegative current. Now, Becker also showed that if you have non-healing bones, that you can cause them to come back alive and start healing by simply putting in electronegative current. Now, the rat doesn't normally regenerate. It's like the human. But he amputated the arm of a rat and put in electronegative current, and the rat grew a new arm down to the elbow. Now, he wasn't able to get enough blastema to form to get the whole arm to form, but at least he showed that it's possible. Now, it was at this point that his funding dried up, and he was never able to finish this. But I think you can see that an area that's ripe for a question that needs to be answered is simply this. In the human, what voltage and amperage and frequency of current, of negative current, does it take to cause normal cells to revert to stem cells? Becker showed that it happens. We just don't know exactly those numbers. Once we have those numbers, amazing things will happen, because this controversy about harvesting stem cells will be over, because you don't need anybody else's. You make your own. You simply put in the right amount of negative current, and you convert your normal cells to stem cells. So that'll be a fun day when somebody gives us those numbers. Now, Becker also shown that the acupuncture meridians on the skin were reproducible, and that the acupuncture points produced electrical direct current, and that these acupuncture points are simply booster amplifiers along the meridians. As you may know, a semiconductor is simply a lattice work, right? A piece of silicon is a lattice work that contains electrons, and those electrons are able to move fairly easily. It doesn't take much to get them moving, but they can't move very far. So in your Sony Walkman, you have booster amplifiers that scoot the energy along in the semiconductors because they can't go very far. The human body's the same way. Our organ systems are semiconductors, and they move electrons easily, but they can't move very far, and so we need these booster amplifiers in those semiconductors in order to send the signals along, and the acupuncture points are simply booster amplifiers for that process. And so along those areas, we are able to then carry these signals through the fibrous semiconductors, and that's the way Becker showed that we are able to communicate. So basically, you have an area that's injured, that electropositive current travels by way of the acupuncture meridians to the brain. The signal comes from the brain back down the perineural nervous system, back to the area, and that's how the body begins the healing process. Now, some of you may be surprised that we have a second nervous system, and some of you may also be surprised that we have two brains. This work was done by Michael Gershon, who's a neurobiologist. And Gershon has shown that we have a second independent brain in our gut. Now, the as far as the autonomic nervous system is concerned, the chemical mediator of the parasympathetic system is acetylcholine, the chemical mediator for the sympathetic is norepinephrine, and the chemical mediator for this enteric second brain system is serotonin. It can also be modulated by substance P. Now, it's been proven that there are about 100 billion nerve cells in our gut, which is similar to the number of nerve cells in our spinal cord. There are only about 2,000 nerve cells in the vagus nerve connecting these 100 million cells to the brain. If you cut the vagus nerve, the enteric system continues to function quite normal, thank you. It couldn't care less that the lines are down between it and the brain. In addition, this enteric nervous system in our gut is the only part of the body that's capable of ignoring commands from this central nervous system. So if our brain says to our gut, turn right, it's capable of saying, no thanks, and turn left. Mm-hmm. Nothing else in the body can do that. So it is indeed an independent second brain in the system. Now, our nervous system is currently taught is that we have the central nervous system with the brain and spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system with motor nerves, sensory nerves, the autonomic system, and we're taught that the autonomic system has two parts, sympathetic fight and flight, the parasympathetic eat and sleep system. Well, it's interesting if you take a look at the autonomic nervous system. It was originally described in 1921 by J. N. Langley in London. Now, Langley, when he originally described it, said it had three parts, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric. There's an interesting thing about Langley. Langley was the editor of the British Journal of Medicine. And if somebody sent in an article that he didn't like, he simply rewrote it and published it the way he wanted it published. So a lot of people became a little bit annoyed with him about that. But you know, as Grandma always said, what goes around comes around. And so after his death, his work was changed, and we dropped out the third part of the autonomic nervous system. And so we changed his work as well. Now, there's an interesting thing that's been shown, and that is that 95% of the body's serotonin is made in the gut. It's not made in the brain. Interesting thing to know, because if you have a patient that has depression, where do we normally think we should attack the problem? We all think that, oh, well, we've got to do something with the brain, right? That's not where the serotonin's coming from. Serotonin deficient syndromes are because we've got parasympathetic or enteric nervous system shutdown. So if you're going to treat depression, you have to treat the belly. Essentially, all of the neurotransmitters that are made in the brain are manufactured by the enteric nervous system. And this enteric or second brain is capable of logic, and thus gut feeling is more than just a saying. It's actually this second brain, and it functions separately from the cranial brain, and so it's important to pay attention to it no matter what you're doing. Now I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about cellular biology, cellular physiology, and much of what I'm going to tell you comes from this book, Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life by Jerry Pollack. Much of what I was taught in medical school and much of what I've heard people around this meeting discussing about what you think you know about the way cells work is incorrect, and I'm going to show you how it really works. Our understanding of cells began when in 1665 Hooke saw pores in cork and he called them cells. And a couple of hundred years later, Pfeffer described a membrane around these cells as we began to get microscopes and could see better. And so he had this membrane theory of cells. Notice we're still talking about plants. Now, one of the problems that happened is that we began to think that the membranes or the cells in humans is the same as they are in plants, which is not exactly true. But the basic concept that was evolved and that had to be explained is why is it true that sodium is high in concentration outside of the cells and potassium is high in concentration inside the cells? So almost everything that we have that we think we know about cells was a theory created to explain that fact. Why is sodium high outside the cells and potassium inside the cells? Well, the original thought was that, well, there must be this membrane separating the two, and so thus the membrane must have some ability to keep sodium out and keep potassium in. So in 1928, Mond and Amundsen found that potassium could flow into and out of the cells, but the sodium was left in higher concentration outside the cells. So in 1941, Boyle and Conway proposed the channel theory, which what you can call a pore size theory, a doggy door theory, a sieve theory, whatever you want. The idea was that like a doggy door, that if sodium is big and potassium is small, that the size of the hole would keep potassium out and sodium out and let potassium come in, right? But the problem with this doggy door theory is that some things that are smaller than potassium were kept outside the cell, and some things that were bigger than sodium came in. So that obviously created a problem with this channel theory. Another problem was found was that sodium came inside the cell. Whoops, what happens to the channel theory? It's a problem. If we got sodium able to come inside the cell, then we've got to come up with some explanation for why it's in higher concentration outside the cell, right? So Dean says, oh, that's easy. There's a pump that pumps it back out. So if it comes in, which we now know that it does, we just pump it back out with a sodium-potassium pump. And thus the idea of the sodium-potassium pump came into existence to explain the fault of a previous theory, namely the channel or the doggy door theory. The problem then arose that there are many other substances that concentrate inside and outside the cell. Well, that's easy to solve. We'll just say there are a whole bunch of pumps. And for everything substance that's supposed to be outside the cell in high concentrations, we'll just say that there's a pump for that. The problem is that there are hundreds of substances that concentrate outside the cell, and so they said, okay, well, we've just got hundreds of pumps on the cell membrane. There's several problems with this channel pump theory. First of all, there physically isn't enough room on the cell membrane for all those pumps and all those channels. Secondly, the energy required for just the sodium-potassium pump theory consumes the entire energy of the cell, leaving no energy for all of those hundreds of other pumps and for the cell to do any kind of work. And if you look at the surface membrane of cells with electron microscope, you can't see any channels or pumps. So how can there be a pump for something, an artificial chemical like a new antibiotic that the cells have never seen before? How can you say, well, it has a pump for that if it's never seen it before? Now, notice that these channel and pump theories were developed based on the original idea that cell membranes in plants and therefore in animals were felt to keep water inside a cell and other things out. Now, another problem came along is that if you amputate part of the cell, it continues to function normally. It couldn't care less that it's got a big hole in the membrane. So the membrane does not function to separate the cell's interior from the exterior. Now, the evidence that supports the existence of pumps and channels can only be understood if we assign them different functions. Here you see the electron photomicrograph at the surface of the cell, and all you see is all of these protein complexes. And these are all over every cell. Now, these proteins that are in the membrane change their shape depending on the charge, so that if you have one charge, the protein may be outside the membrane and another charge inside the membrane. So we can see that what we used to think were pumps, where things are moving across the membrane, are simply things that are attached to the protein structure, and as we change the electronic charge, it moves it in or outside the membrane. It's not really a pump. It's simply this protein moving, changing its shape. Here's another bigger picture showing the same concept of how these proteins change shape depending on the charge that's applied to them. Now, if ion partitioning were to require a continuous membrane acting as a barrier, violating that barrier should collapse these gradients, right? So if you have holes in the cell membrane, then sodium-potassium ought to come to some equilibrium. It doesn't happen. Now, there are three experimental ways to make holes in cell membranes. You can pierce a hole into it. You can take electric current and cause that current to poke holes into it. Or you can take and create a vacuum with a little pipette and pull a plug out of it. So you have these three different ways. Poke a hole into it, use electricity to poke holes into it or pull a patch out, which is called patch clamp technique. No matter how you poke these holes into cells, what's been shown is that the cell couldn't care less. It continues to function quite normally, thank you. And these holes do not close. If you look at cells that have had holes in them for a long time with electron photomicrographs, they still have the holes. They don't heal them. So the holes are there. The cell just keeps working. Incidentally, you probably know this, you can remove the nucleus from a cell and it couldn't care less either. It keeps working quite normally. Even without a nucleus, the only thing it can't do is reproduce itself. But it couldn't care less as far as its function is concerned. Well, the whole pump channel theory was developed because it was thought that the enclosed cytoplasm was water, or at least free to mix with the surrounding fluids, but this simply isn't true. Cytoplasm is gel-like, it's not water, and the proteins in the cytoplasmic gel hold and attract ions, for example, potassium. And most cells will continue to function quite normally even if you replace all of the sodium and potassium with other ions. Now, cells can't function without calcium. They simply stop if you remove all the calcium. And calcium activates virtually every one of the cell's numerous processes. And different enzymatic functions within the cell require different levels of potassium to function. The local concentration of that potassium can be determined throughout the cell locally by how it's attached to the protein gel. Now, Kellmeyer in 1986 preloaded cells with radioactive potassium, and then he made holes in the cell membrane with detergents. And notice that the cell continued to have its normal concentration of potassium until enough of the membrane was dissolved that the whole cytoplasm blurped out into the extracellular space. And incidentally, you remember I told you earlier that in chronic disease, the chronic disease is defined by the tissue becoming electronegative. This is one of the ways it happens because the interior of the cell is electronegative when you have a lot of cells lose their membranes and the cytoplasm comes out in the extracellular space. The area carries that negative electric charge with it, and the whole area becomes electronegative. Now, the interior of the cell is about a minus 70 millivolts. And whenever, as I was just saying, whenever that comes out in the extracellular space due to cell death, the area becomes electronegative. And the same thing happens if you bleed into an area. We've, as physicians and surgeons, we've all known that if you have bleeding into an area, it won't heal until you get rid of the hematoma, right? Now we know why. The reason is that the red blood cells are negatively charged, and when they are dumped into an area, it overwhelms the positive current of injury, which stops the healing process until you drain the blood out, right? Now, water is an interesting portion of this whole process because it's different in different states, and water has the ability to align itself. And when it aligns itself, it changes the characteristic of what it's aligned against. An example is sand. You go walking in dry sand, your feet sink down into the sand, right? You get it wet, you go walking on the top. The sand changes its character as it becomes wet, as does everything that is a gel. Now, water has the capacity to organize into 400 or 500 layers. As you may know, if you take two cover slips and get a drop of water between the two of them, you just will throw them away, right? Because you're never going to get them separated because of the attraction of the water between the two. Here in this diagram, you see free water molecules like this against a protein matrix, and notice how this protein matrix charge begins to line up the water molecules until you have what's called structured water, and this can be 400 or 500 molecules deep. So the structured water is considerably different than free water. Now, the characteristic of protein surfaces is that they are studded with charge, and so the proteins build these long strains of amino acid giving a backbone to the side chains, and the charges arise from the carbonyl, which are negatively charged, and the amino groups, which are positively charged. And these charges cause the water to layer. And so ions then compete with the water for the protein's charged sites. Now, these water molecules line up in an electrical field because of their bipolar nature, and if the field direction is reversed, the water molecules change direction up to about 20 gigahertz. But in restricted water, that frequency drops to just 10 kilohertz. and frequencies below these limits don't change the water movement and therefore its characteristics, which has some importance when we begin to try to understand how electromagnetic frequencies affect cells, but that's a whole other subject. Now, this structured water provides the basis for partitioning of solutes, which provides a straightforward answer to the question of why do we have more sodium outside the cell and more potassium inside the cell. Now, this is done according to the ability of these ions to be dissolved in structured water. The hydrated size of ions is, as you see here, magnesium is bigger than calcium, which is bigger than sodium, bigger than potassium, bigger than chloride, and bigger than the nitrates. And so these magnesium, calcium, and sodium will shun structured water and stay outside of the cytoplasm, while chloride and the nitrates will enter more easily. Now here's a cell that was taken and simply the back third of the cell was amputated. So you got a third of the cell missing, a big hole in the back of it. It's like a submarine with the back side of it blown off, and yet it continues to function quite fine, thank you. And you notice that as you get away from the area where the injury is, that the concentrations of sodium and potassium inside of the cell stay quite normal. So these very same charges and potential gradients that drive induction motors around power lines and gate semiconductor junctions also are what are active within the living cell. And cells with their membranes removed still measure their normal minus 10 to minus 100 millivolts. And so this charge has to come from the cytoplasm itself. Now, the inside of the cell, as I mentioned, is negatively charged at about a minus 70 millivolts. And since the cell's potential and electrical properties arise from the cytoplasm, the membrane itself is relatively inconsequential. Now, here's a little experiment you can do at home. Take some Knox gelatin, dump it in a glass, so now you have protein fibers. Pour in a little bit of water and swirl it around, and now that water will begin to structure itself around the protein molecules, and then drop in some salt. And guess what? The salt will not go inside this gel because the sodium is not capable of penetrating the structured water. You can do this at home and see that it works. And that's the way cells work. Now, because the cell protoplasm is a gel, then inanimate gels have the same characteristics as cytoplasm. And here's kind of a chart. You change these various things, you change the gel, and you change these, all of these things, you also change how the cell works. And that's why we as physicians have to look at pH and temperature and chemical, biochemical, and solvents and the electrical fields and the EMFs and the stresses, etc., because that changes the way the cell functions. Now, the fact that cells and gels self-oscillate has been known for quite a long time. It was first theorized in 1926 by Lakowski, who created the multiwave oscillator, but was again proven in 1991 by Miyano and Asada. So all of our cells have this normal oscillation, and when they lose that oscillation, then it's a sign that they are sick. Now let's look at the action potential of cells, and we think about action potentials as they relate to nerve cells and muscle cells, but in reality every cell has a cell potential, which is essentially the same as it is in nerves and muscles. Now normally this is described as being a sodium-potassium pump, so that as you have potassium leave the cell and sodium enter the cell, that it goes from this negative charge to around a positive 50 or so, and then as those ions go back the other way, that the charge goes back to negative. This is what's in almost all the textbooks, but it can't be true. This is what we normally see, but it can't be true because you can remove all of the sodium potassium from the cell and you still have a normal action potential. So it can't be a sodium potassium pump, right? Now, lying in just inside of a cell membrane is a dense polymer-like gel matrix known as the peripheral cytoskeleton. It's cross-linked with filaments and microtubules, and it has a highly negative charge. So any change in the cell potential has to be a change in this peripheral cytoskeleton. Now, here's a photomicrograph, electron photomicrograph of a cytoskeleton, and you can see this lattice work of protein fibers, and that this is all very negatively charged. Now, if you remove the peripheral cytoskeleton, you eliminate the action potential as shown by Tasaki and Matsumoto in 1950. So the real part of the cell that's in charge of cell function is this peripheral cytoskeleton. Interesting and important concept. Now, a phase transition is where you have a protein that changes its shape. For example, from this coiled shape to this straight shape. It's called a phase transition. Now, when the protein is in this coiled shape, the water molecules around it are not organized. They're free water. But as soon as you apply a charge to this coil of protein, it becomes straight. So energy is required to change the phase transition of this protein. And as soon as it becomes straight, then you get the water structuring along the side of it. Now, if you stimulate that, as I'll show you in a moment, it will release its energy and along with heat. And so these protein molecules in the peripheral cytoskeleton is what generates the cellular potential. Now, this happens when water and sodium enter the peripheral cytoskeleton and expel calcium. The entering sodium drives the potential positive, and as sodium and water are expelled and calcium returns to condense the cytoskeleton, it goes back to negative. So here's what really happens. You have a stimulus. You're about a minus 70 millivolts. The stimulus causes the calcium to leave and sodium and water to enter, which gets you up to about a plus 50 millivolts, and then the exchange comes back. Now, it's important to notice that calcium is divalent, that is, it has two positive charges, whereas sodium has one. So if in a normal extended position in the peripheral cytoskeleton, we have two of these protein molecules, and they're held together with the two arms of calcium, like this. They're zipped up, and that holds it into its extended length, where you have the normal structured water along the side. When it's stimulated, the calcium leaves from the stimulus, this unzips. And as it unzips, it releases the action potential, and then these protein molecules go back into their coiled shape, and then energy is applied to the coiled shape from the phase transition. It straightens it back up again, and calcium comes along and zips it back up, just like a zipper. Once it does that, then the energy is now stored in the cell. So we can see that in its discharged state, a cell is like this. Energy is applied. You get two of these zipping together with the calcium. Then the water begins to line up on the side, and that gives the cell its ability to have its potential to do work. And in this form, where it is zipped up and the proteins are straight and this water is structured, this has an almost infinite ability to store energy. So the cell gets its energy to do its work by having these peripheral cytoskeleton zipped up in this fashion. Now, notice that whenever these cells are stimulated, it creates a positive current of injury, just as Becker taught us. But if a cell is going to be continually stimulated and continually putting out this positive charge, it's going to take a lot of energy, right? And pretty soon it's going to start running out of energy, and that's why the body normally sets up these ionic capacitors around the edge of the injured area to maintain the positive current of injury. Begin to fit together? I hope so. Now, the energy of the cell is provided by ATP, which is produced by the mitochondria, and the ATP in the zones surrounding these mitochondria are negatively charged, and then the ATP translocates to the cell's proteins, and that's why they become charged, and that is where the energy for running the cell comes from. Incidentally, well, we'll come to that in a moment. The charge on the protein orders then the water into the structured water. The structured water drives the proteins into their extended state. The protein-water matrix gains potential energy, and the potential energy is used by the cell to perform work. So if you have a cell that's not working, can't do its job, it's sick, We just figured out why. The problem is always in the electronics of the peripheral cytoskeleton. Now let's consider cells as if they were buckets of water, and that the amount of energy within the cell is the amount of water in this bucket. Cells will always try to keep the same amount of energy balanced in each of the cells, so that if, for example, this bucket has less energy, then these will send electrons over there till it fills up until they're all balanced. And so a state of health is more a condition of being balanced rather than the total amount of energy in each one. Now, in Oriental medicine, it's been known for a long time that these various organ systems serve as a savings account for the opposite one. So if the large intestine starts struggling, it will often get its energy from the lungs. If the lungs start struggling, it'll be sent energy from the large intestine, etc. So each one of these serves as a savings account for the other, energetically speaking. And as you probably noticed, if you have somebody who has long-term large intestine disease, they will almost always develop lung disease, right? And so forth down the line. Now, whenever a cell becomes injured, it will become surrounded by an increase in impedance. As you know, impedance is a word that's more appropriate for the body than resistance, but you can think of it as resistance, which is resistance to the flow of electrons to correct the problem. So if this cell over here is struggling, we have this increased area of resistance or impedance around it, so that the efforts of the other cells to send in help and recharge it are minimized. So around a sick organ or a sick cell, we have this area of increased impedance, and so electrons have trouble coming in and recharging the area. But as time goes on, then the impedance around that degenerative organ will disappear, but also the available electrons to recharge it disappear. Now here's the course of advancing disease. If you measure the impedance or the resistance to flow of electrons, you have a normal level, which can be set up by the algorithm of your measuring device. And as an area becomes inflamed, the impedance around it increases. And it will stay increased until the organ begins to fail, and as degeneration and scarring begin to occur, there's a rapid drop-off so that the impedance becomes less and less until finally it's down in this degenerative area where you can't read anything. An example would be hepatitis. As soon as your liver gets infected and inflamed, you're going to measure an increase in the impedance, and then as it converts from an active inflammation and infection into a degenerative disease, you're going to have a drop in the impedance down into the negative area. Now here's an important concept. This area of increased resistance or impedance around that sick organ will pass through the areas of the body with the least resistance. What are the areas what part of the body has the least resistance to the passage of electrons? Fibrous tissue. Now, fibrous tissue, it turns out, are the acupuncture meridians and the perineural nervous system. So the internal problems of the increased impedance are simply, this increased impedance is simply passed to the skin through these two systems where they can be measured and modified. Now, as you know, Volz found the impedance of acupuncture points to be about 95,000 ohms and the surrounding skin to be about 2 million ohms. And in traditional Chinese medicine, you have the 12 main acupuncture meridians plus the 2 governor meridians, but Volz found 8 additional ones. These lymphatics, nervous system, fatty degeneration, organ decay, non-malignant skin, joints, and allergies. Now, the action of the scanar, which I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, on the skin is transmitted to the deep organ systems by these same low impedance acupuncture meridians and perineural nervous system. If you look at this chart that you're probably familiar with, and let's blow it up a little bigger so we can read it, you can see that each of the spinal nerves have an associated organ system. So, for example, if you have trouble with the stomach, it's going to be T6. And so if the increased impedance around the stomach will be transmitted by the perineural nervous system adjacent to the spine at the T6 level. So if you simply measure the areas that have increased impedance along the spine, you can find the organs that are struggling. Now here's an interesting paper that you may have missed. It's published in the Anatomical Record in issue 6, in actually just last December, It's called the relationship of acupuncture points to meridians in the tissue planes, and this was done at the School of Medicine in Vermont by Helene Langevin. And what they did was, I won't have you read all of this, but basically what they did was found that the acupuncture meridians are simply the fascial planes of the body. Neat, huh? So if you look here, I've taken photographs of cross-sections of anatomical sections and related. You can see these various fascial planes are the various acupuncture meridians. And the governor meridian, the conception meridian, etc. The same in the arms, the same as you look at the meridians on the skin, you can see that they are the fascial planes running through the tissues. And so no matter which ones you want to look at, you see that these fascial planes are the areas of least impedance through the body and therefore transmit the information. So in our example here where we have, say we have peptic ulcer disease, the increased impedance that's around the stomach will be transmitted through two systems. One, the perineural nervous system back to the spine, where we will find an area of increased resistance at T6, and through the acupuncture meridians associated with the stomach, so we'll find areas of increased impedance if it's inflammatory, or areas of decreased impedance if it's degenerative in these spots. See how that works? Now the magic is that once you understand this, you can use these planes, these meridians, or the perineural nervous system as sort of direct wires to the deep organs. So if you want to influence the stomach, simply go to T6 and you've got a direct line where it's an area of decreased impedance, so you can very easily send electronic signals to the stomach from T6. And the same thing from the acupuncture meridians, you can do the same, so you can get this biofeedback system going through this area. Now the scanner, like a Volt system, can measure the tissue impedance and capacitance and then provides the power to penetrate the impedance and modulate the cell's potential back to normal. And it does it with a biofeedback system with these various signals, as we'll talk about more in a minute. So basically what you can do is you find these areas that have abnormal signals, and then you can send different signals back. Depending on what you find, you send back different frequencies and different patterns of signals to modulate the cells back to normal. So as we've been discussing cellular physiology, you notice that a normal cell has a potential something like this, and as it begins to get sick, it's less able to mount this potential, and finally it mounts a very weak one, if at all. And eventually it can't even mount a signal, and that's a very sick cell or a very sick organ system. So if you want to get cells better, you've got to give it enough horsepower to get back up to this normal potential. It's like having a brand new car, but you got no gas in the car. It's not going to go anywhere, right? Same with the cell. If it doesn't have the electronic energy, it's not going to be able to do its job. So if you have a sick cell like this and you send in a signal like this, it will modulate it back to here. And then when you read this signal, it can send in this one, it modulates it back to here, and eventually you're back to a normal signal. So that you have the ability then to modulate the cellular electronics back to normal. And so by simply placing this biofeedback device, and incidentally, I think most of you know the difference between biofeedback and cybernetic biofeedback. Biofeedback involves a conscious mind. You look at a meter that measures your blood pressure, and you use your mind to take it down to a normal level. That's biofeedback that was developed in the 60s, whereas cybernetic biofeedback is where the computer talks directly with the tissue and avoids the conscious mind. And this is a cybernetic biofeedback device that's simply measuring and sending correcting signals to the corresponding tissue, which can be, and it can be done either from the paraspinal area or from the acupuncture meridian. Now once a cell has normal potential restored, it can begin to heal itself. The negative charge is restored to a positive current of injury, and this attracts the chemicals that are needed to heal, the red blood cells, white blood cells, proteins, fats, and so forth, and so the body's normal healing mechanisms are reactivated. Now, as you know, Vold designed a machine that would register normal at the reading at 50, and at the upper end would be 100, and 0 would be no resistance to flow. And he associated specific points on the acupuncture meridians with specific parts of the body. And so here's Vold's chart with normal in the middle, and anything that's above that, any impedance that's above that, goes from irritant to cumulative irritant to inflamed to whole organ inflamed. And as I showed you earlier, once the cells no longer have the energy to maintain this, then you begin to drop the impedance down, and you begin this downward slide of incipient degeneration all the way down to final degeneration, including malignancies. Now, the scanner device has a similar ability to measure the impedance, but it has a different algorithm. And basically in the scanner, though, you can see that numbers that are below 18 or 20 are always in the degenerative range, whereas 25 to 45 is considered normal. So impedance readings above that, you get your inflammation and irritant. Below that, you have this degeneration. And then the modulation of the device changes according to these readings. And why does that matter? It's known in semiconductor technology that if you simply put modulated frequencies across a semiconductor, you increase its voltage, right? Now, it's been shown in experimental animals that the same thing happens. You put modulated frequencies across an animal, it increases its ATP production. And so in the scanner, you simply put it in what's called frequency modulation mode, put it across the tissue, and because the tissue is a semiconductor, you will increase the voltage of the temperature of the tissue. I like to compare this to brownouts. I don't know if any of you are from New England or California had some these last year, I think. You know, your house is supposed to have 110 volts coming in. It drops to 80 volts. Your circuit breakers go off on your air conditioner, your fridge, etc., right? And your lights all become dim. That's called a brownout. Well, the body has brownouts as well. If your cells have the inability to mount their normal action potentials, they're in a brownout condition. Now, if you're in a brownout, have a brownout at your home, and you go out in the garage and flip the circuit breakers back on, what happens if you're still at 80 volts? Flip right back off, don't they? And the body's the same way. So if you go and try to get the cells to do something without restoring the amount of energy they have available, they'll simply flip the circuit breakers back off and they won't heal, or they won't stay healed. So in the body, if you want to get it well, the first thing you have to do is identify the areas of decreased energy. And you can do that with this by finding areas that are below 25, or particularly those below 20. Those will tell you areas that are energy deficient. So you have to restore the energy. So you take the scanner device, you put it in frequency modulation mode, and you can pump energy into that area until you restore it. Once you do, the impedance will then pop back up into this inflammatory range, and now you're ready to go flip the switches from electronegative back to electropositive so the body can start healing itself. You see how that works? Fairly simple, but very powerful. There are some other signs that are associated with these. The skin color around the area where the deep organs is transmitted to the skin. T6 in the example that I gave you for stomach, along the stomach meridians, will be red. You know, first it goes from normal to pink to red, and then as it begins to generate, it becomes pale and white. So you can look at somebody's back that has peptic ulcer disease, and you'll see either a red, if it's inflamed, or a white spot at T6, and you automatically know what's going on with that, with the stomach. You can use these various frequencies to help flip the switch back to normal. You'll notice that sound changes, etc., as you are treating them. We'll skip the intensity and the Z pulse for now, but just remind you that then impedance of the area is able to tell you what's going on in the deep tissues through these connections. Now, Vol recognized a phenomenon where if the reading is fine at first, but after a few seconds it begins to drop to a lower level, it's a sign that the cells have an inability to hold on to the energy, and so that you have to work harder in order, and you know, it's a worse prognostic sign, and that's certainly true with the scanner. If you find areas where the numbers are low and stay low, or if they're higher and then drop dramatically to lower, it's just a worse prognosis sign. It means you're going to have to work a little harder to get the area recharged. Now, in 1926, Lukowski, a Russian-born scientist who lived most of his life in Paris and eventually came and worked in New York and died there, proposed that cells are like a swing and that it needs some energy to keep its vibration going, and proposed that microbes vibrate at different frequencies from cells, and that disease occurs when the energetics of one overcomes the other. And he designed some devices in order to put electromagnetic frequencies in. One of them that he patented in 1934 was called a multiple wave oscillator, which he showed the ability to cure the cancer that occurs in geraniums and then in humans. And delivering these frequencies from 20 hertz to 20 gigahertz, he was able to eliminate a lot of diseases. Now, another technology that shows the same kind of process was done by Kurt Wilden and others, particularly in Germany, showing that when you run glucose through the Krebs cycle, that it's oxidized to pyruvate, and then when pyruvate is split by the mitochondria into carbon dioxide and water, it releases light. And that this light these photons of light are either UV, visible, and infrared. And that this light is then used by the mitochondria to produce ATP. So if you want to increase cellular energy and cellular ATP, you need to send frequencies to it that are generally in this UV, visible, and infrared light wave, and that's why low-level lasers work. He used low-level lasers particularly in the area of hearing loss and dizziness, but his work supports the findings of the Lakowski and the Skainer's frequency modulation mode, providing the body with electromagnetic frequency to increase the ATP. Now let's switch gears and talk about nerve fibers for just a moment, and then we'll come back and tie all of this together. Alpha nerve fibers carry information related to proprioception, like the muscle sense. Alpha, or the A-beta nerve fibers, carry information related to touch, the delta fibers related to pain and temperature, and then the C nerve fibers are related to pain, temperature, and itching. So we have these different fibers and their different sizes and different amounts of myelination around them, but the C fibers are of particular interest to us. Notice that the speed with which things go through them is quite different. If you see that the speed of the A fibers or the alpha beta fibers are this fast and an airplane's that fast, then you compare the little C fiber up here that's slower than walking. But the C fiber is particularly interesting to us because these C fibers are the ones that produce the regulatory neuropeptides. So all of the functions of the body are controlled by the secretions of the C fibers. So if you want to get the body's regulatory system working again, you have to do something that deals with the C fibers, right? So they're extremely important. Now the threshold that it takes to activate those is 15 to 40 times higher than it is to activate the A fibers. So the force of current in C fibers is 225 to 1600 times less than in the A fibers, but the force necessary to excite them is corresponding 225 to 1600 times higher. And so the excitement of these thin C fibers is considerably higher than most methods of electrotherapy. Normal TENS units, for example, will not stimulate the C fibers, and so you don't get the release of the regulatory neuropeptides. The Skainar is unique in its ability to stimulate the C fibers and release these regulatory neuropeptides that regulate the entire body. And when you release these neuropeptides, these regulatory peptides, their action is not just local, but it's throughout the entire system. So it don't matter where they're produced, they can be used by the entire body to correct whatever's wrong. Now, one of the unique things about the Skainer signal is that the first pulse that comes out of it is off the scale. If you look at it on an oscilloscope, if you set it where you can actually see this first pulse, you see nothing of this because of the difference in the range. If you set it where you can see the rest of the signals, this one's always off the chart. And the reason that's important is that that big initial pulse is necessary to stimulate the C fibers to release the regulatory neuropeptides. The other problem is that the body always adapts to electromagnetic signals unless you do what the Skainer has done, and that is that each signal is dampened and each signal is different. It never sends the same signal twice, so you'll always get this change in signal. And for that reason, the body never adapts to the scalar impulse compared to all other electromagnetic signals. So in summary then, the scalar works by both modulating the cellular potential back to normal and by working on the C fibers to release the neuropeptides, which then allows, now that these cells have enough energy to do their job, then they can use these regulatory neuropeptides to regulate itself back to normal and restore itself to health, both locally and distally. So we come back to this original concept that when we have an injury, the area is electropositive, that the body sets up these ionic capacitors in order to maintain this charge at electropositive, which it has to be if healing is going to occur, because it has to draw in all of these things that are necessary to heal. If it happens that the area becomes electronegative, then healing stops. So chronic disease is defined by being electronegative. Important concept. Once it's electronegative, it repels everything it needs to heal, it consumes the local energy, degeneration occurs, and you have chronic disease. So if you want to fix chronic disease, you have to fix these problems. So you go back and you recharge put the energy back into the peripheral cytoskeleton so that it has the ability to again mount its normal electronics. And you will remember that the two things that are critically important with the peripheral cytoskeleton are calcium and water, right? Cells have to have those two things to work. And they have to have those to restore the energy, plus then the mitochondria release light frequencies in order to produce the ATP, which again allows this cell to have enough horsepower to be able to run itself and do whatever its job was intended to be. So we have to restore the energy first, so we find the areas that are energy depleted, we restore those with frequency modulation, and then we go looking for areas that are electronegative. Once we find the areas that are electronegative, which we identify along the spine and along the acupuncture meridians and/or switch those switches back from electronegative to electropositive, then all we have to do is get out of the way and let the body heal itself. So the scanner doesn't heal anything, it simply provides the body the proper electronics so that it can heal itself. And because the body knows how to heal itself, if it has enough energy and the switches are flipped on, it'll go do it. That's the way it works. Now let's just look at for a moment about the scanar. The scanar was developed by the Russian space program under the direction of Alexander Rovenko, a neurologist, along with with his team. They realized that in Mir, that if you give, because their water is recycled, if you give one astronaut penicillin, they all get penicillin through the recycled water. And the same is true in their submarines. And so they set up a division in order to create a non-pharmacy-based medical solution. And over a period of 20 years, they developed this technology. It received approval of the USSR Medical Council, which is their FDA, in 1986. It's licensed in the UK and the European Common Market for pain relief. It's FDA accepted as a Class II biofeedback device in the United States. Here's Sasha Natoichi in my office, along with his chief engineer, Gennady Fursov. Really remarkable and very humble, likable folks. I really enjoy these people. This is Zulia Velieva Frost. Zulia is a Russian-born pediatrician who got her medical training in Russia. She married a British guy named Frost, moved to London, and she's largely responsible for bringing this technology to the West. She's translated the Russian medical articles and the Russian material on how to use the device, and is very active in bringing this technology to the West. Here's all of the FDA stuff for if you are interested in that. It will be in your handout. Now, some interesting things that relate this device to dentistry in particular has to do with the concept of a keystone. As you know, if you're building an arch, you start stacking up these stones, but whether or not those stay stacked or not is determined by the shape and location of this one stone called the keystone, right? If you move this keystone, all of the other stones follow it wherever it goes until the total thing collapses, right? So the keystone in an arch is the stone that dictates the position of all the other stones. Now, the sphenoid bone is the keystone for the skull. Because of its location here and the way the occipital bone mounts into it through the spine, and all of the other bones are on top of it, bringing their weight all into bear, the sphenoid is the keystone. And the position of the keystone dictates all of the other positions of the skull, including the temporal mandibular joint, and including the C1, C2 spinal axis. So as you can see the way it all fits together here, this becomes the keystone. You can see in yellow here the sphenoid from the top and how all of these other bones come into it just like the archway. Now, in addition, you know that there's this joint between the sphenoid and the occipital bone that's a hinge and intended to move, because as you know, this sphenoid bone is intended to pulse 12 times per minute in what is known as the craniosacral pump. The dura that's over the sphenoid attaches to the dura along the spine and eventually to the sacrum, and so these two form a hydraulic system. And that hydraulic pump moves 12 times per minute to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, if you have trauma to the skull that's sufficient to move the keystone, the sphenoid, to some other location, then the entire cranium shifts, as I told you, just like any other arch does, and this hinge becomes jammed so that the craniosacral pump stops working. So one of the results of head trauma is the locking of the sphenoid because of the movement of the keystone. Now, Robert Boyd is an osteopath in Ireland, and he first described what's called the bowling ball syndrome. The bowling ball, what Boyd said was that the head weighs the same amount as a bowling ball and is approximately the same size. And because it weighs so much, the body will always put C1 and C2 under the center of gravity of the head. Otherwise, the head wants to fall over. It weighs too much for the spine to be off center. So no matter what happens, you will move it. And put C1 and C2 under this center of gravity. And I've tried to represent that in this drawing over here. You'll see that when you have a bowling ball syndrome with a displaced center of gravity of the skull, you always have one shoulder that's higher than the other. The spine will be sort of S-shaped. You'll have sacral torsion with one hip higher than the other, which creates a shortness in one leg, etc. Let me just try to give you an example of this. If I'm standing here and my center of gravity is like this, I'm fine. But if I get my sphenoid moved from trauma and the center of gravity moves over here, I have to do this to get under it. So C1 and C2 come over, the spine becomes S-shaped, my pelvis becomes torted, my hips one higher than the other, this leg's too short, this arm's too short, all of my weight's on this hip, that knee, and that ankle. And so I'm like this. And so I go see my friendly chiropractor or osteopath, and they manipulate my spine, and I say, gee, that feels great, but by the time I'm back out to my car, because the center of gravity is still misplaced, I'm back like this again. And so I've got to go back and see my chiropractor tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, because we haven't dealt with the origin of the problem, which is this location of the center of gravity of the skull, right? Now, Boyd, in addition to describing it, described a solution, and he called the solution biocranial therapy. And basically what Boyd said was that because the trapezius muscle is attached from the back of the occipital bone down to the shoulder and along the spine, that if you take and if you fix the shoulder and move the head to the full extension of the trapezius muscle and then move it a little farther, you will, because of the fulcrum of the spine, you will cause this downward rotation of the occipital bone and thus release the impaction of this joint. Or another way of saying that is if you move this bone in the archway, you will allow the keystone to go back to its normal position. Is that making sense? So what Boyd did was, if I can demonstrate on myself, you'd hold a shoulder here, you put your hand under here, you pull the neck as far as it'll go this way, and then you push it a bit further. And he called that biocranial therapy. And there's a biocranial society in the United States, and its primary instructor is the guy who first told me about this syndrome, Doug Hayes from Springfield, Missouri. Now, biocranial therapy works, and there's a biocranial society now in the United States. Another method of doing this was created by Dean Howell, who was up in Seattle, and Dean approached it from the front. And he said, well, if we take and put a balloon through the nose, back to the back of the pharynx and underneath the sphenoid, and then rapidly expand that balloon, we will simply, again, be able to mobilize the sphenoid bone and allow it to go back to its keystone position. And he calls that neurocranial restructuring. It works also. I've had both of those procedures. In my experience, the patients, both for myself and the patients I've seen that have those two procedures, they are helpful, but they're not quite complete, and they don't seem to completely solve the problem. But that's where this technology began. Now, notice that the biocranial therapy depends upon the trapezius muscle being shortened. Well, 14 months ago, I was working on a patient with a scanner device, and I happened to find the particular spot in the neck that put the trapezius muscle into spasm. So I said, gee, I wonder if I really did that a little more aggressively, if I could do the same thing as biocranial therapy. So I cranked the power up and get a really nice hard Charlie horse in the trapezius muscle. Sure enough, I corrected the bowling ball syndrome. So I did it again, and I did it again, and I've done it hundreds of times now, and it always works.
Are that trapezius or sternocleidomastoid?
The trapezius is what's coming up and pulling down the occipital bone. And so the part of the spasm that's in the sternocleidomastoid is the splinting to keep the spine over where it belongs. But it's the movement of the occipital bone. If this is the occipital bone, here's the sphenoid. This is the trapezius. This is the spine. I've got a vector here, right? So I shorten this distance. I do this to the occipital bone. It opens the joint and allows the keystone to move back where it belongs. That's the mechanism. Now, when you correct the keystone, you correct, if particularly interested dentist, is you correct the jaw, the TMJs, because anytime the keystone is moved, anytime the sphenoid's moved to the side, your whole cranial structure moves, and so you will, if you look at a person who has a bowling ball syndrome, you will find one ear lower than the other, their jaw always twisted to one side, which gives them the TMJ. You'll find often their nose is twisted. They'll have one flat cheek. They'll have one eye that's slightly closed. And their C1, C2 will be fairly fixed. If you try to move it, you can't, and you'll see that it's off to the side. They will have burning between their shoulders when they drive or do a lot of dental work, You start getting that burning sensation in the mid-scapular area. You have low back pain because you're torted like this, and if you drive your car, your back really hurts because your head's out of balance while you're sitting in the car seat. And you'll have hip pain, knee pain, and ankle pain because you've got all your weight on one foot instead of the other. And then once you correct that, then all of those things begin to go away, including your TMJ, just poof, it's gone. The spasm that's in that side disappears. Ability to rotate your neck comes back.
Clothes don't fit.
Clothes don't fit. Yeah, as long as I remember when my dad bought me my first suit when I was just a little guy, we had to have the leg and the arm 1 inch longer because I was like this. And I just thought I was born with one short leg and one long leg, you know. So all my life I had my clothes always altered 1 inch different on the side. Once Doug Hayes fixed my bowling ball, I had to go back and retailor my clothes because they were too long on that side, and now my legs are the same length, arms the same length, etc. And a lifetime of migraine headaches just simply disappeared once I fixed the bowling ball and got my pump working again. So of all the things I know how to do, I've done a lot of fun things in my life. You know, having a patient walk in that's led in because they're blind and a week later they drive their car to my clinic was a great thrill to me. Taking people that have been blind for years and doing corneal transplants and having them see again was a great thrill. But you know, I think as far as the most bang for the buck of making people feel good, this is it. Of all the things I know how to do, I've ever done, fixing the bowling ball is the most magical of them all. And so I agree with Vaughn when he says this does amazing things for people. And so this is the description of how to do it tonight at the workshop for those of you who want. I'll fix your bowling ball if you have one, and then I'll teach you how to fix it if you wish me to do so. Let me just share with you a few cases here and of similar kinds of things you can do with this amazing technology. From my world of ophthalmology, there was a fellow who was 70, had a retinal detachment, was fixed in Wichita, Kansas by very good surgeons, but he never saw out of the eye significantly afterwards, and he had uncontrolled glaucoma with pressures in the mid-40s on multiple glaucoma medications. And so 8 months after the surgery, he came to see me. On his exam, he had 2200 vision, he had corneal edema, he had inflammation in the front chamber of his eye and in the vitreous gel of his eyes to the extent I couldn't even see the retina. I simply put the device below the eye like this for 4 minutes, above the eye for 4 minutes. I saw him the next day. The next day, he's 20/30, his cornea is clear, his chamber's clear, his vitreous was clear, he still had some retinal edema. So I treated him again, 4 minutes here, 4 minutes here, saw him the next day, 20/20, no medicines, pressure normal, etc. Nothing else I can tell you will do this. He was treated in all of the right ways by all of the allopathic methods that he should have been treated by, but it wasn't working. And 48 hours of the scanner made the difference. This is also a very personal case for me. This is my granddaughter. She was born at 1.5 pounds the day after Christmas a year ago. Now, when she was born, she had 7 hernias on her belly, she had a hole in her heart, and when she was sent home from the hospital, she had class 2 retinopathy of prematurity from the oxygen. Her mom called me and said, you know, she's starting to turn blue periodically. So I went out to see her, and when I started measuring her, you could not get any measurements of energy from the tip of her head to the tip of her toes. Energetically, she was zip. So I just put the scanner into recharge mode and started with the pituitary, pineal axis, and then just started brushing her skull, brushed everything, brushed over her heart. After I was working with her just a few minutes, she turned pink and has never been blue since. By the time another 2 or 3 months had gone by, the murmur left her heart. She healed a septal defect in her heart, which incidentally Dr. Ravenko's grandson had the same thing, a heart hole in his heart that healed with the device. But she healed 6 of the 7 hernias on her belly. Unfortunately, the surgeon got to the 7th one before I got it finished. And the scarring in her eyes went away. So she continued to thrive and was doing really well and was at above the charts. You know, the pediatricians have charts of what you're supposed to do when you're a given age, and if you're premature. She was way off the chart above that, was thriving. They couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And, you know, Mom just kept every day pumping a little more energy in. And then when she was about 5 months old, I was told that she'd never had an unassisted bowel movement. I didn't know that that was the case, It always had to use a Q-tip to get things going for bowel movements. So I went out to see her, and there are 5 places on the belly that you use to turn the enteric system back on. So I started, 2 minutes at the first one, and I was just working on the second one when she filled her diaper, and has been doing that fairly regularly ever since, with one exception. A few weeks ago, she quit eating and started having bowel movements only about every 5th day, and when she had them, she would scream and yell, and they would be bloody. And she simply had rectal stenosis. And they had recommended that they put in a feeding tube for her since she wouldn't eat, and she was beginning to lose weight. So I checked her with a scanner and found a patch right here on the right side of high impedance readings, and simply treated it using the traditional scanner rules. It takes 10 or 15 minutes, and we were done. And the next day she started having bowel movements, and then the following week she gained 8 ounces. So you can do magical things with the device, as you can see. This is my wife, Marilyn, who's sitting there on the back row. Marilyn had 5 surgeries in 5 months in 1983. She had a hysterectomy for endometriosis. They scraped the lesions on the bowel and the gut, and a week later she had a rectovaginal fistula. So the 7 inches of the rectum were removed, followed the next month by intestinal obstruction, and the next month by intestinal obstruction, and the next month by intestinal obstruction. So she'd done pretty well after those 5 surgeries until a few months ago. We had come back from a conference in Mexico, and she started having some abdominal discomfort and thought she was probably getting Turista. But pretty soon the pain turned into her old nemesis, the typical pain of intestinal obstruction. So we went to get x-rays, and sure enough she had not 1 but 3 obstructions, and you could see the fibrous bands around the gut. So she was sent to the surgeon, and while we were waiting to get in to see the surgeon, we took the scanner and we measured her belly, and from the xiphoid to the pubic symphysis, and from one side to the other, this was energetically dead. So we put it into frequency modulation mode and just began painting the belly. And the power level what we painted was as high as the machine will go, which incidentally is high enough to do cardioversion. And she couldn't even feel it. And so we kept painting and painting and painting, pumping in the energy. And after about an hour and a half or so, finally she showed me where the switches were. There was a little patch of switches that showed up right here. And so we flipped those switches, and 10 minutes later the bowel started working. Shortly after that, we went in to see the surgeon. He repeated the bowel x-ray, but with barium follow-through, and all 3 fibrous bands had disappeared, and she was perfectly normal, and has been ever since. Similar kind of story about a GI thing. The kid who lives across the street from me is 19. Stephen would always come over and help me with my yard and help watch the dogs when we traveled and so forth. And one Saturday I heard that he was in the emergency room with appendicitis. So I went up to see what was going on, and the emergency room doc had sent for the surgeon to come take his appendix out. And so I looked at his chart, and he had all of the usual things, the left shift, increase in bands. And then I checked him. He had a total ileus. He had rebound tenderness at McBurney's point, etc. And, I would have taken him up and taken his appendix out myself, except, so I put my stethoscope away and got out my scanner, and I did the 5 points on his belly to turn the system back on, and then I switched it into the acute mode, put it over the McBurney's point, and I'd had it there between 2 and 3 minutes when my friend Larry, the surgeon, walked in. So I just dropped the scanner in my pocket, and Larry said, "Jerry, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, Stephen's my buddy and takes care of my house, and I just came up to see what you're going to do to help him." So Larry gets out his stethoscope and listens, and he starts mashing on Stephen's belly, and he mashes and he mashes and he mashes a little harder, and he said, "Stephen, are you having any pain?" And Stephen said, "Well, I was having a lot of pain earlier, but I'm fine now." And he said, "Are you hungry?" He said, "I'm starved." And Larry said, "Get up and go home. There's nothing wrong with you." So Larry went out to write on the chart, and I got my stethoscope back out. normal bowel sounds. I pressed on McBurney's point, normal, pain all gone. So he also avoided the surgery and is fine to this day. This was a lady that came to see me with arthritis in her hips. She came walking in sort of like this, and she had bone on bone in her hips, had been on this walker for 10 years, hadn't had a good night's sleep in 10 years because no matter what position she got in, it hurt. So we treated her with the device in the usual way, and at the end of the session, she was pain-free. And so she went home, and instead of doing what we told her to do, she helped her daughter move out of her apartment. Of course, the next morning, because we turned the healing mechanism back on and the hips started healing themselves, she came in with more pain than she'd had in a while, which incidentally is a good sign because you know, when you turn the body back on with the scanner, it thinks you just got injured because it just starts the new healing process. So people often hurt the night of treatment, which is a good sign because the healing process is working. But nevertheless, we retreated her. Her pain pretty much went away. Then we saw her the next day, and by the end of the next treatment, her pain was gone. And by the end of the week, she'd thrown her walker away and was bending over, picking up her pencil off the floor and things she hadn't done in years. And so on it goes with a variety of these different things. This is something that is interesting about cavitations. This is a lady that came with this picture, and we treated her with a scanner, and afterwards she got this picture. Now, our friend from Cavitat tells us that you have to be careful about when this was taken, because if you do energetics and increase the blood flow to this area, that sometimes it will get this picture. I can't tell you for sure how long it was between the time that we treated her last and this picture was taken. I can tell you that energetically the cavitation seemed to be gone and all her symptoms were gone that were associated with that meridian. So it seems to be another possibility. We've certainly taken people that have pain, particularly pain in a tooth that the dentist can't find anything wrong with. We simply put the face probe on the outside and run the series of frequencies. Then we have what's called an acupuncture probe that's able to get in the mouth. We put it in on the gum right next to that tooth, run the frequencies, and generally the pain's gone and doesn't come back. So it's a nice way to get rid of these nagging dental pain things. And oftentimes you can take a tooth where it's been recommended that they have a root canal. You treat it 2 or 3 times with this approach, and the pain's gone, and they no longer consider a root canal. So, in summary then, what I've hoped that I've done today is to tweak your interest in the concepts of cellular energetics. Yes, there's a question.
You had something there on Mercury that you passed by. Could you just explain what that was?
Well, you know, mercury, as this group knows better than most, mercury is a significant toxin, and that if we go back to the concept that in energetic medicine the body knows how to heal itself, and if it has enough energy and the switches are on, it'll go do it, and that also holds true for mercury toxicity. You can turn all the systems back on and they'll start dumping. Yeah.
I know that Hal Huggins says that we can get rid of mercury. I mean, our bodies can get rid of it, but he talked about a mercury retention toxicity syndrome. So what you're saying is that if it can turn that on, then the body can get rid of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Max Collins is an interesting chap. Max is a chiropractor over in South Carolina, and let's see, how am I doing on time? I've got 3 minutes to tell you about Max. Max grew up in a town where they mined uranium, and to extract the uranium they used different mineral water things to extract the uranium, and they dumped the excess out in these big ditches, and they told the townspeople this was simply mineral water, so all the kids went swimming in it. And so Max developed prostatitis at age 13 and skin rashes that wouldn't go away and other kinds of problems, but he didn't know what was wrong with him until he was in college. And in college he was taking a physics class, and they went into the laboratory and the Geiger counter alarm went off. So they vacated the lab, couldn't find any leakage, brought everybody back in, and it went off again. And they discovered it was Max. And that was the first time he knew that he was radioactive. And so he wanted to be an engineer, but he went into medical areas because of his own personal health to try to figure out a way to get himself well. In addition to the mercury poisoning, the uranium toxicity, he was mercury toxic as well. And so Max began to work on the area of looking at each atom and the association of the use of electromagnetic frequencies, particularly in the light range, to correct the electron shells. And he developed the concept that the frequency needed to cause the body to excrete different metals was related to its atomic number. And so he came up with the frequency that he thought would get rid of mercury, and he called a friend of his who was director of the satellite system for the U.S. He said, I want you to find me an area of the ocean that's this particular color that's within driving range of my home. So about a week later, the guy called back and said, okay, go to this little town in Florida, and 100 yards off the coast, that's where you'll find this water that's this color. So Max went down there, started a 24-hour urine collection, put in an indwelling catheter so he could take periodic blood samples, and began swimming in the water. And he had found just by accident that the only time he ever felt good was when he was scuba diving. And so he began to dive, and he would go to 1 atmosphere of pressure, 2 atmospheres, and so forth, and then take more samples. What he found was that simply swimming in this water caused him to dump, so it was like 6 times the amount that anybody had ever seen anybody safely dump mercury. And so he helped prove his theory that that particular frequency of light would cause the body to dump mercury. And so he then went back home and began to develop a light-emitting diode system that would recreate that frequency. And as evidence that he's done it, I'll give you an example that last month he treated 3 autistic children, and within less than 2 weeks he had them talking again. And I mentioned earlier my buddy Bob Vance from Las Vegas. One of Bob's grandsons in Colorado was autistic. And Max treated him with this same frequency of light, and the kid is now in normal school. That is just another example of why I believe more and more every day that I see things, this statement that I made in the beginning. The body knows how to heal itself, and if you give it the appropriate energy and turn on the switches, it'll do it. It's a long-winded answer for it.
What number is the frequency?
I've got it written down. I've got it built into the system where it does it automatically, but it's basically 1 over the atomic number. Well, so what's the atomic number of mercury? Anybody know? Anyway, it's 1 over the atomic number, and it gives you the frequency that you need to get rid of any mineral. Well, what I've hoped to do in this time is to tweak your interest in energetic medicine in particular. And Barbara has something held up. What? Oh, yeah. If you'll pass all of these forms for people who want copies of my lecture, just be sure Barbara gets it.
We're in the back of the room there, because if they don't do it, leave some back there. What was Max's last name?
Collins. Collins. C-O-L-L-I-N-S.
Dr.
Yes.
Tennant, would you be in the panel discussion tomorrow?
Sure, I'd be happy to participate. What
I don't
time?
like too many people asking questions. I don't want to ask you a long question. My question would be, in order to avoid the branding of being a panacea, what would you say about the possible limitation or up to this point? What kind of limitation would you say about the Schindler therapy?
The primary contraindication for the scanner is somebody who has an old pacemaker. Older pacemakers, as you know, were not shielded against EMFs, and so you could cause problems with those. We have treated people with pacemakers by either avoiding the area or working with a cardiologist with them hooked up, so that if we activate the pacemaker, or then they can deal with it. But primarily, the scanner is. Oh, the other thing you don't want to do is dislodge a clot. So if you're working on, you say you have a varicose vein, and it works good at getting rid of those, but you don't want to be rubbing it across the varicose vein if there's a blood clot in the middle of it, right? Same thing with the carotid. So you don't want to massage things where there might be a clot. Otherwise, the worst thing that happens with the scanner is that nothing happens and you've wasted your time. And that happens 5% of the time.
Treating during pregnancy?
You can treat during pregnancy. We tend not to treat on the fundus just because there's no long-standing research about it. I'm less spastic about that now that I've treated a granddaughter that was, was 5.5 months gestation. The infant was that age when I started treating her, so it gives me some comfort to know that at least at that stage of the game I'm not likely to cause harm. But generally speaking, if you're treating a pregnant woman, you just avoid the fundus, the uterus, and just treat the mama. Yeah.
Deep vein thrombosis would be another contraindication.
It depends on how long it's been there.
Several months, 4 months.
Yeah. See, the likelihood of you dislodging a clot at that stage, particularly if it's deep and you're not really rubbing on it, is minimal. What you're going to do is simply deliver the energy to it so the body has the horsepower to go heal itself. What you don't want to do is a mechanical dislodgement of a superficial clot, or don't want to work on a carotid where you might flip off something that would cause a stroke.
Is this an advanced Rife machine?
No, not really. Rife machine is designed to, the theory behind a Rife machine is simply that it will create a resonance with the cell membrane of the microorganism, causing it to rupture, and thus it's a bug killer. With the exception of it has been found that if you send out frequencies of 10,000 hertz or 5,000 hertz, that you can improve the immune system by generally activating the neutrophils. But other than those two frequencies, all of the frequencies of Rife machines are intended to kill bugs, whereas this device is intended to restore the energetics, the electronics to each cell so that it has enough horsepower to do its job, and then to switch the polarity of areas that are electronegative to electropositive so that the body can start its normal healing mechanisms. Killing bugs is something that it does indirectly by activating the immune system so the immune system can go do what it normally does best. Yes?
Did I see that you jumped over oral galvanism?
Yeah, I did that because I felt like this group knows more about that than I do, and it's simply a matter of the fact that, again, back to the theory, people are always asking me questions. Well, will this thing treat, I have somebody whose teeth itch. Will they fix that? Or they have, athlete's foot, or they have irritable bowel syndrome, or they have whatever. And so I'm always asked, will this help that? And the answer is probably, because the body knows how to heal itself. You see, and so we have to quit thinking about syndromes and start thinking about simply on the matter of, does your car have voltage in the battery sufficient to turn over the starter? If it does, it'll likely start. Okay? Well, here's another question.
In a situation in cancer where chemical intoxication has stalled and diminished the numbers of cytotoxic T cells, that situation of chemical intoxication, how would that be changed if indeed you could affect the cytotoxic T cells for a period of time? How would you affect the chemical intoxication, the fatty storage that is dumping slowly, this intoxicant that is overwhelming the immune function? How would the larger problem of detoxification be accomplished using the scanner?
First part of the answer is that I'm not a biochemist and I don't know all of those pathways. Secondly, the basic concept is that the body knows how to do all of those better than we can know. No matter how much research we've done, there's still things we don't know about how all that works. But if you release the body's normal regulatory neuropeptides and you recharge all of the body's cells so that they have enough energy, they know what to do. And I know that's a very simplistic answer, but it's basically the best I can do, and that is that no matter what's wrong with you, if you've got the abnormal proteins that Dr. Jones talked about, it's simply a matter of the body knows how to fix those if it has the energy to do it. And that seems to be the way it works. I wish I could give you a better biochemical answer, but I can't. I can just tell you that the body knows how to do it. Yeah. Thank you.
One more comment on something you had said yesterday that I hadn't mentioned today, on that this device has a similar effect to the beefy devices, the aqua chi devices, as far as restoring the overall charge, bioenergetic field of
Yeah,
people are familiar with those devices.
Yeah, basically, these chi devices basically are using an ion exchange in the water through the iron and copper electrodes in order to provide extra electrons to recharge the body. The problem with that approach is that it takes so long. If you talk to Terry Scrinjar, who the inventor of the Q2, he will tell you that it takes about 2 years to recharge the body to normal levels. And 2 years is a long time if you're sick. So that, for example, I've taken at least 10 cases of diabetic neuropathy that have been absolutely numb from the knees down, and a week later their feet are normal. And so why wait 2 years if you can do it in a week?
How did you cure yourself?
The truth is that I'm not sure because I did so many different things. I used, I got rid of all my amalgams. I detoxed from mercury. I used Rife machines. I used several different kinds of Rife machines. I used homeopathy. I used some Sanum remedies. I don't know what worked. I just, dumped it all in there, but the process, but it was all energetic medicine, and something worked. So I can't tell you how I got well. But I can tell you I like vertical better than horizontal. Well, you've been very kind and give me this much time. Thank you very much.
Wasn't this the type of information that AABD should be doing and presenting? I mean, how do you feel about Jerry's presentation? So if any of you come across some excellent researchers or presenters, please contact Bill, Carol, all of us to present that, because this is the quality of nature of the speakers and presenters that we want to have on the AABD program. So we're going to come back for lunch. Bill, is there anything you want to say? 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock, be back here for our next meeting and be here in sharp. And